remarkably, a very strong case can be made even without looking at Christian documents to begin with. Using only non-Christian documents from the 1st century after Jesus. I'm talking about people here like the Jewish historian Josephus, Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius, Roman writer and governor Pliny the Younger. These are all non-Christian sources writing within the 1st century after Jesus.
Well, I want to reply to Callum. First of all, I've already conceded for the sake of argument that the probability of the resurrection, given the McGrew's evidence F, is very, very high. So, I mean, I said I'd give it a 1 minus 10 to the negative 14th, which is 14 nines. So I already said that. So basically everything Callum had to say is irrelevant. I conceded that to begin with. Let's talk a little bit about Bayes' theorem. I want to talk about Bayes' theorem and the swamping of the priors. I can see this is going to mess up my PowerPoint the way it is formatted, but I think we can still live with that. So this is known as the odds form of Bayes' theorem. If you have two hypotheses, can I move around with the sound okay? So if we have two hypotheses, H and not H, the probability of each of them on evidence E will be equal to the probability of H and not H in and of themselves. That's this term here. And the degree to which each of H and not H makes the evidence E likely. This is called the explanatory likelihood or explanatory power. This is called the prior probabilities ratio, and that's the posterior probability ratio. So, even if the prior probability ratio is very, very small, if the explanatory power ratio is sufficiently large, then the final probability ratio will itself be very, very large mathematically. You don't need a lot of algebra to see this. If this is a whole lot larger than the degree to which the prior probability is small, then the posterior probability ratio will be very large indeed. And if the prior probability ratio is extremely small, if the explanatory power ratio is massively larger, then the final probability will be extremely large as well. Okay, so this is something I will be using tonight. Let's look at an example from Whately and Napoleon. This is Richard Whately, who wrote a very important book, very famous book called Historic Doubts Relative to Napoleon Bonaparte, and I'll let Napoleon speak for you. So let's let N stand for the hypothesis that Napoleon existed, and this little tilde means not. Okay, so not N is the hypothesis that he did not exist. And we can see here by Bayes' theorem that the probability of him existing given the evidence divided by the probability of him not existing given the evidence is equal to the ratio of the prior probabilities times the explanatory power ratios. So let's suppose this is very, very small. Let's suppose it's 10 to the negative 12th. And this is very large, 0.99999999999, so it's very large. So our ratio is approximately 10 to the negative 12th. But let's assume we have 1,000 pieces of evidence, NE, excuse me. And so each piece of evidence is made twice as likely by N as not N. So we're going to have a staggering explanatory power ratio. Well, so this will be about 10 to the 300th power. And so you can do the math, right? 10 to the 300th minus, right, 12 will be 10 to the 288 power. We will have a staggering final probability for the existence of Napoleon. In fact, the evidence will make the existence of Napoleon probable to 1 minus 10 to the negative 288th power, which is a massive, massive number, right? We don't normally see things like this. Now, what does this mean for the resurrection? Those who, like Callum, hold that the prior probability of the resurrection divided by the probability of the prior probability of Jesus not rising is no less than 10 to the negative 30th, and who, like the McGrews, hold that the ability of the resurrection to explain the evidence F, right, is at least 10 to the 44th times higher than the probability of the non-resurrection theory to explain the facts F. We will find that the final probability of the resurrection theory will be 1 minus 10 to the 14th, or 0.99999999999. That's a lot of nines. In other words, if the evidence is strong as the McGrews say, and if Callum is right that the prior probability of the resurrection is no less than 10 to the negative 30th, then the final probability of the resurrection will be staggering, given that evidence. Okay, so here's Whatley. I like the swamping of the priors very much. You should, okay? Now, I'm sorry the spacing of this is off. On my home computer, it worked fine. Tonight, we're going to use the swamping of the priors to show that it is virtually certain that no miracles, not just the resurrection, no miracles at all have ever occurred, including the resurrection. And of course, Whatley would say, well, no, I don't like that, okay? And so, time for Callum, okay?
I think, yeah, okay, I'll just say a brief bit just to make sure I've explained from my own end, like, everything, but it probably won't be anything new.
I think it may be showing mine now, so
yeah,
I'll have to switch.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so this is mine, okay. So here, oh, is it not? How do you make it stop? Oh, there we go, okay. Okay, so here I've just done R, meaning the resurrection, instead of the normal hypothesis. And yeah, I've got the same form as Greg's put up, but just switched these latter two factors round. So yeah, just basically the main thing, at least from my perspective, to bear in mind is that the final probability of the resurrection, given the evidence, is going to be dependent on a few things. And so we don't really need to understand maths hugely to get this. You just need to grasp that it depends on a few different factors which we'll be debating tonight. And the first factor is the prior probability of the resurrection. And that just means how likely is it that the resurrection occurred before we look at any of the evidence. And this is probably going to be quite low. It might not necessarily be really low, and we'll probably debate that. But the idea is that it's fairly low, and then that the evidence will increase the probability so that the final probability of the resurrection, given the evidence, is a lot higher. And whether the evidence overcomes that is dependent on this middle factor. And the top part of that middle factor just says the probability of the evidence given the resurrection. That just means if the resurrection happened, would we expect the evidence? Does the resurrection theory roughly predict the evidence we have? And the bottom factor just says, what is the probability of the evidence given that the resurrection didn't happen? And so we might, again, disagree on this, but the idea from someone who's advocating the resurrection is that they will say, if the resurrection didn't happen, this evidence is really, really surprising. We wouldn't expect to find this evidence if the resurrection didn't happen. So the idea is that that bottom factor is low. And if the top factor is high and the bottom factor is low, the whole factor will be a very high number, and so it will increase the original probability for the resurrection. So I think that's pretty much enough to get us covered. And like I say, if you don't understand it completely, don't worry. The idea is that the probability of the resurrection, given the evidence, is dependent on these things, and that's the things we're going to be debating about. Thanks a lot.
Bayes' theorem shows that for an extraordinary claim, your starting probability, the prior, matters. In the case of a resurrection, the prior probability is extremely low because, in all of human history and biology, no confirmed case exists of a person coming back from the dead after days in the grave. Clinically, brain cells begin dying within minutes without oxygen, and irreversible decomposition starts within hours. This is why medical science treats resurrection as biologically impossible. Historically, miracle stories are common in many cultures. Apollonius of Tyana, Romulus, and Osiris all have resurrection legends. Yet we don't accept them as literal history because they lack contemporary, verifiable evidence. The same problem exists with Jesus. The Gospels were written decades after the events by anonymous authors based on oral traditions, and they contradict each other. For example, Matthew 28:8 says the women ran to tell the disciples right away, while Mark 16:8 says they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Using Bayes' theorem honestly, the combination of an extremely low prior probability and weak, inconsistent second-hand evidence means the mathematical odds remain vanishingly small, just as they do for every other resurrection claim in history.
So I'm going to begin with a story. The story is this. The year is around 4 BC, a small, rowdy but unimportant corner of the Roman Empire. Caesar Augustus is lord over Rome, most of Europe, North Africa, and Israel. It's an unhappy arrangement. Most Jews begrudgingly submit to their de facto king, while others violently resist. In a small countryside of shepherds, fishermen, and outcasts, a baby is born. He grows up fairly modestly, submitting to his parents, working as a manual laborer in nearby towns. 30 years pass, and he might well have lived and died with no one ever knowing. But one day things change. This nobody finds a few other nobodies fishing, and they join him. This nobody performs miracles, not to the important people or to kings, but to peasants. Not to win acclamation, but to heal and to serve. There are no mega churches, no flashing lights, no #1 Yeezy album. He reaches out to oppressed people, to untouchables, and to other outcasts, healing them and inviting them to join his kingdom. To join not for material gain, but for friendship with himself, the king. A king who bends to wash the feet of his subjects and humiliates himself so that the last, the least, and the lost can be honored. And so important people from the city begin to hear things. And so they test him. Who is the king? Do we pay taxes to the king, Caesar? If he says yes, he gets killed by the Jews. And if he says no, he gets killed by the Romans. So Jesus asks, whose image does the coin bear? Caesar, they reply. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. The coin bears Caesar's image, but you bear God's image. Caesar can have his coin. I want you who hate me and who try to kill me. And so his disciples later protest at the anger and all the things that have been said against him, and they say, Lord, call down fire on them. Jesus' best friend even goes to kill one of his arresters, but Jesus rebukes him and heals the man. Love your enemies, he tells them, real enemies, those who arrest you and crucify you. And so as he claims kingship and divine authority, as he judges the important religious people for hating their enemies and outcasts, they kill him. They give him a death so excruciating and lonely that Roman citizens were exempt from it. A death so shameful that Hebrew law regarded the crucified as accursed by God. And so the movement was dead. The wannabe king died as he was born, a lonely, rejected loser from Nazareth. But a few days later, those who followed him and abandoned him began to preach that he was alive and that he was king. Those who rejected him all along began to say the same thing. This band of losers from the Galilean countryside traveled across Europe, Asia, and Africa, declaring that this crucified criminal and blaspheming peasant had been raised from the dead. People from the lakes of Galilee and from the high council in Jerusalem began to throw their lives down for him. They shared any riches they had with the poor, prayed for their enemies, were thrown into prison, and killed with stones and crosses, so that a few decades later, bishops in Syria were writing, come, fire and cross, come hacking off of limbs, come crushing of my body, and come the cruel tortures of the devil. Only let me reach Jesus Christ. And the invitation these early Christians had was this: come to join this kingdom with a king who sits not on lofty thrones but nailed to a cross, by his own subjects whom he loves and serves. A kingdom that prevails against the corrupt, greedy and violent kingdoms and states of this world. A kingdom that endures against suffering and even against death itself. A kingdom that offers such freedom that those who join in it endure against all afflictions, and such freedom that comes from friendship with the king himself. A freedom from the shackles of shame or guilt, from the need for popularity, from the longing for reputation or acceptance, and from any other secret addiction to money, sex, or whatever else we long for and beat ourselves up over. And so this is a challenge. The king tells me that I must love my enemies and forgive those who wrong me. He tells me that if I don't have time for the lowest, most unimportant person I come across, then I don't have time for the king of the universe himself. And that's the kind of radical acceptance he asks for. But following this servant king is a challenge that many from the very start have accepted, and with it changed the world. So the question now, of course, is, how did this all happen? What led this band of outcasts, council members, and Romans to go willingly to their deaths in the name of a public embarrassment? Jesus. I'm going to be arguing that the evidence we have strongly suggests that God raised Jesus from the dead to vindicate his ministry and to start a movement following him. So remarkably, a very strong case can be made even without looking at Christian documents to begin with. Using only non-Christian documents from the 1st century after Jesus. I'm talking about people here like the Jewish historian Josephus, Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius, Roman writer and governor Pliny the Younger. These are all non-Christian sources writing within the 1st century after Jesus. And from these people we learn the following: that Christians were widely persecuted across the Mediterranean from a very early age. That Jesus' own brother James was executed by Jewish authorities in AD 62. That Jesus himself was crucified under Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. That the movement stopped briefly before resuming on the 3rd day, is the language Josephus uses, in Judea before spreading to Rome. That Christians met on a fixed day, as Pliny writes. That Jesus was called the Messiah, the Christ. That he was called and known as a wise man and a miracle worker. And that Christians even prayed to him as a god. That Christians had a stringent moral code, and that they spread widely in large numbers very shortly after Jesus' death. And so it's important not to underestimate the force of this evidence. Many of these facts are attested multiple times across these non-Christian authors and are beyond historical doubt. So, there are a number of other facts we can establish without the resources of Christian writers and biographers. It is virtually certain that any given Jewish criminal in Palestine in the reign of Pilate would be buried in a known place. I have laid out some of this evidence for this elsewhere, and I will just summarize it now. There's a divine command throughout the Old Testament to bury the dead, both for the dead's sake and for the land's sake. Since anyone hung from a tree is cursed according to Deuteronomy, there's an extra reason not to leave someone who was crucified out without being buried. God commands explicitly that anyone executed must be buried properly in order to avoid defiling the land. So this wasn't just something that was for the sake of the dead person. This was something for the land. And so it doesn't matter that Jesus would have been a criminal. What matters is that the land was holy to the Jewish culture. And so there would be an absolute obligation to bury them. This command is reiterated throughout the Old Testament and afterwards, both in apocryphal literature and in the Dead Sea Scrolls found at Qumran. In addition, first century writers Philo and Josephus repeat these same sentiments, and in later rabbinical writings, in Midrash, in the Talmud, and other Jewish writings after the time of Jesus, the need for burial is re-emphasized again and again, and it's even commanded to high priests. This non-Christian historical evidence is clear about burial protocol. Bones from the corpse were collected a year later and put in an ossuary. In the case of criminals, ossuaries would be transferred to the family tomb. Public mourning for criminals was prohibited, so praying inside tombs was often necessary, and excavations have confirmed this. Spices and perfume were typically taken to the tomb, and respected holy men would usually have their tombs venerated. And finally, we know from non-Christian literature, from Jewish writings, that the Sanhedrin, the High Council in Jerusalem, was given a specific duty to provide a tomb for executed criminals. And so, even if there were no reasons to remember where Jesus was buried,
Callum's account is moving, but emotion isn't evidence. When we strip the narrative back to history, the resurrection story starts looking like many other religious legends. Josephus, Tacitus, and Pliny the Younger, the non-Christian sources often cited, weren't eyewitnesses. Josephus was born after Jesus' death, and the famous resurrection line in Antiquities is recognized by many scholars as a later Christian edit. Tacitus wrote about 80 years later, likely repeating what Christians already claimed. This is exactly what we see with other myths, like Apollonius of Tyana, where later historians recorded stories without verifying supernatural events. The burial claim also doesn't hold under real-world Roman practices. Crucifixion was meant to humiliate, and Rome often denied proper burials to those convicted of treason or sedition. The archaeological record backs this up. Only one crucified victim from Judea, Yehohanan, has ever been found with a burial, and even he appears to have been an exception due to family influence. The Gospels themselves disagree on the burial. Mark 15:46 says, Joseph of Arimathea alone wrapped the body. John 19:39-40 adds Nicodemus and 75 pounds of spices. Matthew 27:62-66 uniquely claims guards were posted. Details that read more like theological embellishment than consistent history. And while Miller frames the spread of Christianity as proof of resurrection, history shows that growth and martyrdom aren't unique to true events. The followers of Sabbatai Zevi in the 1600s, convinced he was the Jewish Messiah, endured persecution even after he converted to Islam. Devotion proves belief, not that the belief is accurate.
Well, I want to reply to Callum. First of all, I've already conceded for the sake of argument that the probability of the resurrection, given the McGrew's evidence F, is very, very high. So, I mean, I said I'd give it a 1 minus 10 to the negative 14th, which is 14 nines. So I already said that. So basically everything Callum had to say is irrelevant. I conceded that to begin with. So, he regave the argument for the resurrection. I already accepted his conclusion and said that is irrelevant to start with. I granted that the resurrection miracles have a high prior probability. I do want to say that Callum did not reply to any of the specifics of the argument I gave, But I want to point out here, I don't know if you can see this. Can everyone see this okay over here? Okay. Callum argues that God would do certain things. It's probable to some degree that he would. I want to argue against Callum that for any proposition P, unless P is actually entailed by, let's use G for theism since I've used T for testimony. So let's let G be theism. I want to argue that the probability of any proposition P on G is simply undefined unless P is entailed by G, or unless G is logically, probabilistically independent of G. So I want to say that this is simply undefined. G alone does not have enough content. You can't get any specific probabilities out of G alone because G does not have a value theory. You have to add to G some kind of a value theory. So let me write this. This is not a good pen. We'll have to talk about the probability of any proposition P on G conjoined to some value theory G, such as that God has certain obligations to do certain things for humans, right? Now, then you can get some interesting probabilities, but the thing is, your value theory V will need to be proven first, and all the examples Callum has given are where the probability of V is undefined or not high enough. So when he argues that God would be likely to do this or that, I simply think we don't have any proof of that, unless he's speaking of what we call subjective degree of belief. If those are his personal subjective degrees of belief, then I agree with him. Those may indeed be high. But if we're dealing with rational degree of belief, right, epistemic probability, his probabilities are not epistemic, they're personal. I want to go back and talk about something from our debate 3.5 weeks ago that Callum did not address. I meticulously laid out a huge argument showing how if you accept, and much of what Callum had to say about the burial of Jesus and things like that are not in dispute. I simply think those are red herrings. What I argued last time, and I gave a Bayesian argument to show that it was very probable, Callum did not reply to that 3.5 weeks ago, he hasn't replied to it tonight. I showed in detail that if you accept the hypothesis that Matthew's purpose in writing his resurrection stories is to supply the missing appearance to the disciples in Galilee that's not in Mark, you can explain every single aspect of the resurrection stories in Matthew. They all fall, the predictions are immediate. They all make perfectly good sense. Matthew includes Jesus' statement to the disciples, "Go to Galilee, there you will see me. I will go before you to Galilee." The angel says that to the women at the tomb, go tell his disciples he's going before you to Galilee. And in fact, in Mark, we have the story where the women are afraid. They say nothing to anyone, but Matthew leaves that out on purpose. This is not because he's a historian. He realizes if he has that story in there, he can't have Jesus appear to the women. And so he cuts that out. He actually has Jesus appear to the women only long enough just to say, get those guys to Galilee. And so they go to Galilee, and there they see Jesus. All this is explained perfectly by Matthew being a literary construction, not actually based on history. This is not to say there was not an empty tomb. It's not to say there were no appearances of Jesus, but it's to say you cannot rely on the gospel details. Now, I showed last time that if you accept this as a literary theory, you can explain the data of Matthew's gospel. If you accept Matthew's gospel as being literally historical, you cannot explain this to the same degree. I gave a Bayesian argument. I even assumed once again that the prior probability of the hypothesis that opposes mine is 0.9. I still showed how my hypothesis reaches a high posterior probability. Callum did not address that 3.5 weeks ago. He's not addressed it tonight. I also showed that you can explain Luke's gospel as, again, a literary construction, not based on actual history. I am no ways denying that there were appearances. I explained those last time. The disciples went to Galilee. They saw Jesus the way Jesus told them. He said, Jesus told them before he died, "You will see me risen from the dead." And they went to Galilee because Jesus had told them that's what they'd see. And of course, they meditated, they went into trance states, they did see Jesus risen from the dead. Not as a physical body, but as some kind of a ghostly-like apparition. Cavin made a big point over the fact that they knew the difference between ghosts and bodies. This is true. But Jesus told them that they would see him up in heaven as a spiritual figure. They saw exactly what he told them they'd see. Now, when we move on to the Gospel of Luke, which is 30 years later, I again claim 3.5 weeks ago tonight that you can explain all the details of Luke's Gospel as a literary construction. He leaves out Jesus' statement, go to Galilee. Why does he do that? Because Luke has all the appearances either in Jerusalem or right near Jerusalem. He can't have the disciples go to Galilee. If they run off to Galilee, they won't be able to see him in Jerusalem that very day, right? So he cuts that story out. It's not a coincidence that Matthew has that and Luke cuts it out. You can explain this as a purely literary construction. The appearance to the women by the two angels in the tomb, and what you can't see this here, unfortunately, it's not clear enough, but if you compare the statement of the angels in Luke to what is said in Mark, Luke is a very conservative author. He'll only change an earlier author if he has to, and he makes little changes what Jesus has to, what the angel says. He leaves in Jesus told you, and he leaves in the word Galilee, but now he says, do you remember how Jesus told you while he was still in Galilee, right? And go home and don't take my word for it. Never take my word for it. Go home, compare the statement of the angels in Luke to the statement of the angels in Matthew to Mark. And you can easily see changes being made by the later authors on purpose. The appearance to Peter, the appearance at Emmaus, the appearance in the upper room, right? All those are literary constructions because Luke has a need to have Jerusalem as the central place, the birthplace of Christianity. If you take that hypothesis, it explains all the literary data you find in Luke. It explains also why in John, right, you find Jesus appearing in the upper room too, because John is a later gospel. It explains the Thomas story. It explains why Jesus later on appears in Galilee, because John knows both Matthew, who only has an appearance in Galilee, and John knows of Luke, who has appearances only in Jerusalem, so John has them both. He's the latest gospel. You can explain all of this. So Cavin made a big deal about the details of the appearances, that they were multimodal, talking with Jesus, walking with him, touching him. All that comes from simply not responding to my literary hypothesis, which I gave a Bayesian argument for 3.5 weeks ago today, to show, and we can call that up to show that this, you cannot rely on the Gospels in detail as evidence for the resurrection. You can get some general points from them, but you can't press the details. At least this much. Neither the McGrews, Craig, Lacona, nor here Cavin have responded to my detailed Bayesian argument otherwise. So I would still wait for Cavin to reply to that. Cavin said briefly that he could account for the laws of nature on the resurrection hypothesis, but again, Cavin did not do what I did. I gave 3 mutually exclusive, jointly exhaustive hypotheses. Again, I accepted his conclusion that the posterior probability of the resurrection on the facts of F is 1 minus 10 to the 14th. I accepted that. And again, he did not respond to the fact that my argument takes this into account and shows that the ultimate probability of the resurrection on all the evidence being E, turns out to be remarkably low.
Greg Cavin's closing point cuts to the heart of the problem for the Christian claim. You can't just assume what God would want to do without proving it first. God raised Jesus is not an inevitable conclusion from theism. It's an assumption built on a specific theological value system that itself needs evidence. Without that, you're not working with objective probability, just personal belief. The gospel accounts themselves are another major issue. When you line up Matthew, Luke, and John, you see deliberate literary editing to serve theological goals, not consistent historical reporting. Matthew pushes Galilee appearances, Luke erases them to keep events in Jerusalem, and John tries to harmonize both traditions because he's writing even later. This is exactly how legendary development works. Later writers reshape earlier stories to fit new purposes. We also know from ancient biography studies that the Gospels follow the patterns of Greco-Roman literary construction, not modern investigative history. Scholars like Bart Ehrman and Michael Goulder have shown how changing small details, like who first saw Jesus, where he appeared, or what was said, was common in ancient storytelling to make a theological point. That's why the contradictions in the resurrection narratives are not trivial. They are signs we're looking at crafted literature, not reliable eyewitness reports. Even if you grant, for the sake of argument, a high probability for appearances, that doesn't prove a physical resurrection. Visions and apparitions are well-documented psychological phenomena, especially in grief. From Marian apparitions to loved ones seen after death. The disciples' experiences fit that pattern far better than a violation of all known biological laws. So, when all the evidence is considered, historical context, textual editing, human psychology, the probability of a literal resurrection remains remarkably low. Passionate belief can spread a story, but belief is not the same as truth. If the resurrection stories were shaped by theological agendas and later editing, can we really treat them as reliable historical evidence? Share your thoughts in the comments, hit like if you found this breakdown useful, and subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the history and evidence behind religious claims.